Hello everyone. I am Carol Anderson. I'm with the Mississippi Humanities Council, and it's really great to see all of these faces here tonight. First thing I want to ask is if you haven't already, if you would mute yourselves, or maybe we muted you, I'm not sure. And if you haven't had time to do this yet, we want you all to take a moment to change your name. There were instructions as you were logging in, but we want you to change your name to a particular way of listing yourself. We want you to put your state initials first and then your name. So if you look up at mine, I have MS-Carol Anderson, and this will help us put participants from each state into the various discussion groups. So if you take a moment and do that, if you haven't already, and then with that, I'm gonna turn the reins over to Brian Boyles. He's the Executive Director of Mass Humanities. So Brian, if you wanna take it away.
Thanks so much, Carol. It's so exciting to look around and see so many MSs and so many MAs here tonight. This is the launch of Miss Mass. I think someone needs to be muted. This is the launch of Miss Mass, creating connections, crossing borders, and connecting stories, a series that we've been working to put together for a few months. I'm so excited to see all of you in a nation so stricken and focused on division. Tonight, we're really seeking to make a new connection, to reach out human being to human being and build a bridge. Miss Mass gives us that opportunity to get to know each other and to know another state, and to hear about our lives and share our stories and concerns and talk about the ways that the humanities impact us and how we see one another, and hopefully acknowledge each other's humanities. The series started really out of a series of conversations between the staffs of Mass Humanities and the Mississippi Humanities Council, 2 of 55 state councils serving their states in unique ways all around the country. We got together to really talk about how we might partner, and we focused on some questions. What did we know about one another? What did we maybe get wrong about each other? What could we do to set the stage for learning together? How could the humanities really shape our view of the world and the ways in which we talk to one another? We also really wanted to make a priority of making sure our audiences got engaged. And tonight, not only will you hear from some great writers, but Zoom allowing, you'll get to talk to each other. So in a few minutes, we will go into breakout rooms, and you'll be able to talk about the things you hear from our speakers tonight, but also to talk about the perceptions and misperceptions you may have of Massachusetts or Mississippi. I have to thank Jennifer Halwitt and Carol Anderson, program officers at Mass Humanities and Mississippi Humanities Council, who have done so much of the work to put this together tonight. And I have to also say it's a thrill for me to get to work together with my friend and my colleague, Stuart Rockoff, the Executive Director of the Mississippi Humanities Council. Stuart, good evening. How is the weather down there?
Hey, Brian, it's raining. And it's cold, so it's about 50 degrees, or as we call it down here, freezing. Thanks so much, Brian. This is really, really exciting, and I want to welcome everybody to really this groundbreaking program. The Mississippi Humanities Council is very excited to work with our friends at Mass Humanities on this 6-part series, which will encompass a wide range of topics, from literature and history to contemporary issues that connect our seemingly disparate states. To start the series, we wanted to address directly the the issue of images and stereotypes. How are Mississippi and Massachusetts perceived by outsiders? How do those perceptions affect how we see ourselves? That's a big issue in Mississippi, I think. And how have our respective states been depicted by our greatest writers? As Mississippians, we are very used to having to explain the complexity of this place to others. Quentin Compson does to his roommate at Harvard in Faulkner's novel, Absalom, Absalom. Whenever I talk about Mississippi to someone from elsewhere, I inevitably use the word complicated. I probably overuse the word complicated. In fact, I think that should be our state motto, Mississippi, it's complicated. So when we thought about who we could get to help explain this complexity, who could interpret our state's rich, but often admittedly dark history and culture, we could think of no one better than W. Ralph Eubanks. Ralph is a visiting professor at the Center for the Study of Southern Culture at the University of Mississippi. He's the author of the books, The House of the road, the story of 3 generations of an interracial family in the American South, and Ever is a Long Time, a journey into Mississippi's dark past. Both are wonderful, and I highly recommend them. We're excited that he has a new book coming out, I believe in early 2021, which is entitled A Place Like Mississippi, a journey through a real and imagined literary landscape. So as you can tell, he's pretty much perfect for this. And so when Ralph agreed to participate in this program, we knew that this was going to be a great start to this series. And then, Brian, we were very excited when you all suggested Michael Gorra.
It really feels exciting to introduce Michael. He is the Mary Augusta Jordan Professor of English Language and Literature at Smith College right here in Northampton, the author of A Portrait of a Novel, Henry James and the Making of an American Masterpiece, which was a finalist for the Pulitzer Prize in biography. And then this year, The Saddest Words, William Faulkner's Civil War, which was a New York Times notable book, and which the Times called a mesmerizing work of literary thought. To have someone right here in Massachusetts who's both a scholar of Faulkner, but very much someone who we felt could talk about a Massachusetts that is maybe not exactly what folks think it is, felt like a good way to put the puzzle together with Ralph. So happy to have Michael here with us today.
Thank you so much, Brian. Hello, everyone. My name is Jennifer Halwitt, and I'm a program officer at Mass Humanities. And before Professors Eubanks and Gorra speak, we're going to give you a little bit of time to meet each other in breakout rooms and reflect on the list of impressions that you sent us in the survey about how you see our 2 states. And we've summarized your answers in a document which we sent you ahead of time, and that is also linked in the chat. So if you haven't already printed that document out, or you don't already have it open in another window on your computer, please go ahead and just click on that link in the chat right now. And if you don't have the document printed out, you may find it helpful to have 2 windows open at once so that when you go into your breakout room, you'll be able to see the members of your group and the document at the same time. And if this feels too complicated, don't worry about it, but I'll just quickly explain how to do that. You'll want to exit out of full screen mode. To do that, you can just take your cursor and click, left click twice, just a quick 2 clicks, and you'll exit out of full screen mode. And then you can see that you'll be able to see your other window open. And as I said, if you can't figure out how to do this, if it feels too complicated, it's no problem. Somebody else in your group will be able to read the document to you. So you're going to be in your breakout rooms for about 12 minutes. You're going to have 2 minutes to introduce yourselves, just about 30 seconds each. So I recommend just doing a short introduction. You might just tell everyone your name, where you currently live, and whether you've ever been to the other state. So for myself, I would say, hello, my name is Jennifer. I live in Hadley, Massachusetts, which is in the rural western part of our state. And I have never been to Mississippi, so I'm really looking forward to learning more about your state at this event and for our whole series. After that, you're gonna have about 10 minutes to just answer some of the discussion questions that we've put on the document that you can link to in the chat. So we're going to be asking you to look at the lists and reflect on what you notice and on what surprises you. And we're also going to ask you to tell each other about some of the ways in which the impressions you see on those lists are accurate or false or misleading. If you have any problem while you're in your breakout room and you feel like you need some help, just click on the blue button that you're going to see that says leave the room. And I will be in the main room and I'm happy to help you. And then we can send you right back into the breakout room. And if for any reason the internet throws you out while you're in the breakout room or at any time during this meeting, you can come back in. So just click on that original Zoom link and you can come right back into the meeting. All right, so I'm just going to very quickly share my screen so that you can see the document. If for any reason you have trouble accessing it, I'm just going to give you, a short amount of time right now just to kind of take a little look at what's on this list. So at the top, you'll see impressions of Mississippi. The first were those of you in Massachusetts, naming on the top left there what your impressions of Mississippi were, and then naming, and then on the right, as those in Mississippi, how do they think that Massachusetts views Mississippi? So those are those 2 views. And then for impressions of Massachusetts on the left bottom, you'll see Mississippi's impressions of Massachusetts. and then how Massachusetts thinks that Mississippi views people in Massachusetts. So a little complicated, but you'll get that way both impressions of our states from kind of both sides. So I'm going to stop sharing right now. And Ashley, if we are ready to put everyone into breakout rooms, you should go automatically into your breakout rooms. Ashley, as soon as you're ready to send everyone, let's have you do that. And if you need more time, just turn your video or your audio on and let me know. And I'll share my screen again. I think we're just about back to everybody. So Stuart, I'll turn it over to you.
Yeah, great. Well, it's great to have everybody back. And it is now my great honor to turn it over to my friend, Ralph Eubanks. Ralph, looking for Ralph.
All right,
There he is.
There I am. Yeah, I got kicked out a couple times. So I'm just, it wasn't the quickest move back between the room. So I want to thank everyone for having me here. And Stuart, it's really a great honor to do this. I know that you've all gotten the reading, and I wanted to talk a bit about that reading. And it's all about Willie Morris. And Willie Morris may have returned to the University town of Oxford after his days in New York, but he never lost his connection to the land that he felt made him a writer. No one except Willie, and of course everyone called him Willie, could say about the Delta, it is still Old Testament to me in its ageless rhythms and despairs. For Willie, the Delta was a place of spiritual communion and scripture that was to be interpreted and debated. It is also where he confronted both his personal ghost and as well those that haunt the entire state of Mississippi. Although he is best known as a Southern storyteller, what Willie Morris did was change the way both people in Mississippi and those outside of it thought about the Delta as a place, both visually and culturally. Willie changed the way we see the Delta. It was through Willie's focus on the Delta as a place and a landscape that he allowed readers a window into Mississippi's past, as well as its changing present. I thought the first chapter of North Toward Home would be a good place to start thinking about Mississippi, since it introduces the reader to a location that Willie knew intimately, specifically the Delta town of Yazoo City. He describes every detail of the place with love and specificity, from the way the kudzu lurches toward the highway to precisely the way the road approaching Yazoo makes a sudden descent into the Delta. From this first chapter, a reader may think this is a book that is going to focus on the nostalgia of Southern Place. But this is a book that's more than wistful musings about a privileged, small town, white Southern boyhood, and a place that has been described as the most Southern place on earth. In North Toward Home, Morris moves nimbly between exasperation with the moral failings of Mississippi and adoration for the place of his birth. In total, North Toward Home is a book about an intellectual awakening, more than it is a book about the Delta. It is also divided into three parts. First part is set in Yazoo City, Willie's hometown. The second is in Austin at the University of Texas, and briefly in Oxford, where he was a Rhodes Scholar. And the third takes place in New York, where he was editing Harper's Magazine at the time he wrote the book. Critic James Olney, in his writing about autobiography and life writing, observed that a memoir is a monument of the self as it is becoming. That is exactly what a reader will find in North Toward Home, the intellectual and political awakening of a man who was shaped by the waning days of the Jim Crow South. In North Toward Home, Willie Morris confronts the complex feelings Mississippians have about a place with which many of us have forged a somewhat tortured relationship. Unlike Faulkner's Quentin Compson in Absalom, who vigorously denies hating the South, Willie expresses a less daunting sentiment at the end of North Toward Home. He says, "Why is it, in such moments just before I leave the South, did I always feel some easing of a great burden? That weight Willie feels lifted when leaving Mississippi is what historian C. Van Woodward characterized as the burden of Southern history. In the South, our history is always present and can't seem to be escaped, particularly in Mississippi." Now, bear in mind that Willie wrote North Toward Home when he was only 32 years old. As he grew older, he continued to feel the weight of the Southern past, but he had begun to see it as less of a burden and more like something he wanted his readers to understand. Rather than feeling weighted down by the history and the legacy of Mississippi's past, Willie began to explain that history, whether it was through sports in the courting of Marcus Dupree or through the civil rights movement in the ghost of Medgar Evers. In his book, Tell About the South, Fred Hobson notes that the Southerner, more than any other American, has felt he had something to explain, to defend, or to affirm. Willie chose to explain rather than defend or affirm. Tonight, we're seeking to make connections between Massachusetts and Mississippi, which I admit is a great challenge. What I think connects the two places is that these are two states that everyone thinks that they understand, but only examine on the surface. If I were to compare Mississippi to another place, I would not compare it to a state in the West, in the South, or even the North. The only place that I have ever been that reminds me of Mississippi is Ireland. Like Ireland, Mississippi's history is filled with suffering, as well as people and events that must be explained. What both places have in common is that it is the beauty of the land, mixed with its complex history, that both inspires and perplexes its writers. That is the burden one feels to write about Mississippi, since it is both a place that everyone knows about, or at least claims to, yet few are willing to seek to understand. As Flannery O'Connor said, the Southern writer is forced from all sides to make his gaze extend beyond the surface, beyond mere problems, until it touches that realm that is the concern of prophets and poets. And that is from her essay, The Grotesque in Southern Fiction. Now, O'Connor is from Georgia, but very well could have been writing about Mississippi writers in that sentence, since we all feel the need to describe the place with the greatest of intimacy, yet in a way that makes what is unique about Mississippi resonate with an air of universality. For better or for worse, Mississippi has become a metaphor for the entire South, and for that matter, even the entire nation. As Malcolm X said in his autobiography, as far as I am concerned, Mississippi is anywhere south of the Canadian border. Given that the weight of the nation's original sins of race and injustice have been placed squarely within the state's borders, its writers have felt a unique burden to use that metaphor in the places they write about and in the stories that they tell. A story about race set in Mississippi is as much about the sins of the nation as it is about the sins of the Magnolia State. After writing North Toward Home, Willie Morris came to see himself as an outsider or observer, while still maintaining his insider identity as a Mississippian. Through Willie's dual status as an insider and outsider, he opened part of Mississippi to the rest of the world, since he made Mississippi feel like a place where an outsider might feel welcome. Because he tried to lift the veil off the mystery of the Delta. I believe that is why it is not unheard of for writers from outside the region to want to see the Delta as a setting for their own work. The most successful of those works are by writers who follow a pattern that is the reverse of the one Willie chose. They seek to become insiders, while at the same time keeping their status as outsiders. So in the spirit of Willie Morris, I invite all of you who may be peering into the world of Mississippi tonight as outsiders to come to see yourselves as insiders. And from those of us who are insiders into the culture and literature of the Magnolia State, we would like to welcome you into our world in all of its tortured, messy glory. Thanks.
Thanks so much, Ralph. Now we're going to hear from Michael Gorra.
Well, Ralph is going to be a hard number to follow, and I want to reiterate his praise for North Toward Home. It's a really wonderful book. So a few years ago, I was sitting in a cafe in Oxford, Mississippi. It's a place called the Bottle Tree Bakery that some of you might know. They make muffins and scones, croissants and bread. You can have a sandwich, soup, salad. It's a comfortably scruffy place with old mismatched tables, and emphatically not part of any national chain. But it's also the sort of place that you can find in most college towns. I used to go every weekend to a spot very much like it in Cambridge, and we certainly got its equivalent where I now live in Northampton. The Bottle Tree has a counter, and I was sitting at it over a chicken salad sandwich, and the man on the next stool, he was eating the same thing, a man about my own age. When he heard my accent, he asked where I was from. I told him, and then he laughed out another question. Did anything good ever come out of Massachusetts? I took a second to mull that one over and wondered about just how snarky I could get away with being in reply. And when I think about it today, I've got a pretty good list. There's the Red Sox and the Celtics, higher education, Johnny Appleseed, the American Revolution, William Lloyd Garrison, fried clams, gay marriage, Emily Dickinson, car talk, cranberries, medicine. But instead I laughed back and just said that where I was from, some people might just flip that question around. Yes, but we don't care, he said. And again with a laugh. And then over the next half hour, he showed me just how much he really did care by trying to explain the state to me. Mississippi now, as seen by a 60-year-old deer-hunting, church-going, college-educated, conservative white man. We still talk when I go down to Oxford. We have a meal, drive through the countryside. Once we went to the B.B. King Museum in Indianola. And he's got what the Chapel Hill scholar Fred Hobson, and I too am going to draw on Fred Hobson's book, what Fred Hobson has called the Southern Rage to explain the region, not just to outsiders, but to oneself. Ralph mentioned Hobson too, his book, Tell About the South. Some of you will recognize that as a quotation from Faulkner's Absalom, Absalom. The question his character Quentin Compson is asked as a Harvard freshman over and over again. And though the boy tries to answer that question, whenever he does so, he's always talking to himself above all. Well, Mississippi or Massachusetts, as Quentin thinks to himself one night. Massachusetts or Mississippi? The place where he was born and the place where he's going to die as a suicide. Two states that begin with M, and each of them with so many double letters that they're hard to spell. But they're also more than that. Both Faulkner and Henry James in the passage from the Bostonians that I asked you to read, those two great American writers, they each saw the two states as an emblem for their sections as a whole. And I guess Ralph touched on this too. Each of them standing as the most extreme form of regional consciousness. One, the heart of Yankeedom, of abolition and union. The other is what's been called the South of the South. Of course, the funny thing is that neither writer had ever yet been to the other man's state, and James never got to Mississippi himself. They relied instead on common knowledge, on what they thought they knew, which is to say on stereotype. One place today, deep blue, the other bright red. And yet the first time I went to Mississippi in the fall of 2008, I saw a lot more signs for Barack Obama than there were in Massachusetts for John McCain. What goes to make up a Massachusetts consciousness or identity? What's distinctive about it? What does it mean to be from here? And that's a bit of a stumper. I can tell you how each New England state differs from the others, how they all differ from New York. But I don't think most people in the North think much in terms of their state as such, with the possible exception of Mainers. And that's maybe one of the differences between the two places, Massachusetts and Mississippi. For one thing, an awful lot of people in Massachusetts were born elsewhere. I'm originally from Connecticut myself. I came here for college, went away to California, came back for a job. I see myself as a New Englander above all. Our latest Nobel Prize winner, Louise Glück, she's lived in Cambridge for a very long time. But I don't think anyone really thinks of her as a Massachusetts poet. But then there's no longer really a distinctive Massachusetts literature, despite all the great writers who've chosen to live here. No more, not since the 19th century anyway. We had a distinctive literature then. Since then, I think not so much. It's somehow more generic. It's not specific to this place, the way there is a specific literature in Mississippi, a literature that tries to say what it means to live there. Here we've only got the crime novels of George V. Higgins. Nor do we have anything like Mississippi's extraordinary musical heritage. Tanglewood is wonderful, but it plays Beethoven and not the homegrown blues. The region's laureate, Robert Frost, he's born in San Francisco. Even a lot of our politicians come from elsewhere. Elizabeth Warren was born in Oklahoma and only got to Massachusetts in middle age. The states up here are small. Boston isn't only the state capital, it's that of the whole region. And without driving very fast, I can cross 4 state lines within an hour and a quarter of my front door. In Mississippi, that would only get you from halfway from Oxford to Jackson. New England states do have a common history of settlement, coastal towns founded in the 17th century, the same architecture, the same story of farms abandoned after the Civil War, with people leaving for the easier lands of the Midwest, and the reforestation that followed. The same patterns of immigration, Ireland, Italy, Portugal, that has made this once Puritan land into a Catholic one. The same big brick mills for shoes and textiles, guns too, now shuttered for cheaper places in the South and then abroad, and repurposed, if you're lucky, for apartments and artist studios and tech startups. To me, the New England landscape looks just right. Its coastal marshes and modest hills, apple orchards and cornfields, the twisty potholed country roads and those brilliant autumn leaves. And as I say that, I realize I'm describing a rural landscape, and one of the perceptions that the Mississippians have of Massachusetts is that it's urban, not where I live. Of course, we have regional habits. There aren't many places left with an annual town meeting, but we do have a high degree of civic engagement, social trust and cohesion. Yet the Mississippians who perceive us as cold, they're not wrong, and they don't just mean temperature. There are people in my town whom I've passed on the street every day for years and never said hello because we haven't actually met. We avoid each other's eyes because to meet them would mean admitting that we recognized each other. We are terse and brusque and judgmental, and all too apt to condemn those who fall short of what we think they should be. That's something Hawthorne knew about, and he's still a good guide. The passage I've given us from the House of Seven Gables points to the grim past of the Salem witch trials, an ancient crime, a judgment made in the name of principle, but really in the name of profit, a way to enrich yourself while sounding high-minded about it. And that's New England too. It's a story about dispossession and conscience and hypocrisy, about the way the past can come back to bite you. This isn't just a New England story, of course. And as I reread it this morning, as I read about the building of the Pynchon House, I was reminded of Faulkner's Thomas Sutpen in Absalom, Absalom, tearing his own great house in the wilderness. These days, we don't worry so much about the witch trials anymore. But as I read my local newspaper this fall, I could tell that New England is still conscience-stricken, with lots of letters around Thanksgiving and what used to be called Columbus Day, about a moral stain on the land, a theft from its first people. One way to look at that is to say that New Englanders, well, we like to feel guilty. Even those of us who grew up Catholic, as I did, we're Puritans still. But we might also say that that consciousness of a dark history, a history that stays with us no matter how much we want to insist on our exceptional American innocence. Well, that's something that does bind our two states together. Thank you.
Thank you. And I think we were going to have, so Ralph, Michael, if you have any questions for each other or sort of conversations, we'd love to be a fly on the wall or a fly in the Zoom.
Yeah, I guess I was thinking about the James piece from the Bostonians, because
Right.
it's that really struck me, because there's this real connection. I mean, I was talking about Willie changed the way we see the Delta.
Mhm.
I think that Henry James's characters, it's not important as much as what they do, as much as what they see.
Mhm.
Thinking particularly about Lambert Strether and the ambassador. So that's kind of part of that, and that the excerpt that you shared from the Bostonians, it is what he is seeing there at that
Right. Right. You know, and that's a very it's a moment that is really unparalleled in James's work. It's one of the few places in his work where he addresses the question of the Civil War. More often he's writing about Americans in Europe, but in this book he tried consciously, as he said, to write an American novel. He'd never been to the South at that point, but he did have a couple of younger brothers who had been officers in the 54th and 55th Massachusetts, in the Massachusetts raised regiments of black troops, which had white officers. And some his brothers had been wounded in the war, which he didn't fight. A Memorial Hall is this sort of place in which the North, the Union, sort of crows about winning. It lists the Harvard dead, but only the Harvard dead who fought for the Union. And what Basil Ransom finds when he goes there, though, is that it still seems to speak to him. It speaks to him of loss, of a shared bravery with both sides. It speaks to him of a moment of reconciliation between the sides that was getting going in the 1880s. A lot of historians have written about that reconciliation recently. Above all, David Blight from Yale talks about the way that reconciliation was a reconciliation between the white and North-South, and sort of ruling out the black people. White North, white South united and agreed to ignore the question of race. You know, and Memorial Hall Memorial Hall doesn't do that because it insists on Union victory. It was went up in the 1870s before that reconciliation movement got going. It went up when Reconstruction was still a live issue, was still being supported by the federal government. But yeah, James, I'm going on too long, but James does always have this focus on what you can see, what you can understand. That's what he's about, is understanding, seeing, not the doing. And even though Lambert Strether says, live all you can, for him, living all you can is just seeing all you can.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's what I've always thought about James, is kind of seeing what you can, not really doing what you can.
Yeah.
But you know, thinking about that idea of that you mentioned with Memorial Hall, kind of developing this place of memory, that also kind of speaks to what I think we are addressing, where we have our segregated cultural memory.
Right.
We have the segregated cultural memory between the North and the South, and even within the South, there is this degree of segregated cultural memory we have between Black and white, which is really coming out now as we begin to confront the issue of memorialization, since we've just moved a monument on the campus of the University of Mississippi from the center of the campus to a Confederate cemetery. So, and you're thinking about this idea of cultural memory in New England, and that in the 19th century, that not really having this cohesive literature, how does that change the identity of someone from Massachusetts? What impact does that have?
Yeah, as I said, I don't think that many of us think of ourselves as being from Massachusetts specifically. I mean, when you're growing up as a kid, you do. It depends also on where you go to. If you go out of state for university, most people from Massachusetts, a lot of people from Massachusetts do go out of state for university. You, I think you have a regional identity more than a state identity. A regional identity. But I don't think that regional identity clusters around things like literature, or not recent literature, maybe 19th century literature, the literature that you are made to read in high school. Some of us keep on reading it, of course, but it doesn't cluster around that. It's the landscape, it's beaches, it's Cape Cod, it's patterns of leisure. It is the Red Sox. The Red Sox are a big unifying thing in New England, all the way up to the Canadian border in New Hampshire. But I don't think we and it's a paradox because Massachusetts is culturally so rich, but it's not. We don't think in terms of so much. I think of the culture that's made here once we get into the 20th century, because New England, New York is fluid. People move back and forth for jobs and colleges and universities. Everybody in New York seems to have spent time in Massachusetts and vice versa. It's fluid in that way, in a way that doesn't make for, I think, a cohesive sense of local identity. You might have an identity in your town, but not so much in the state. It sounds very different in Mississippi.
Yeah, well, as we were talking before this, I said, Mississippi is not a state; it's a club.
Yeah.
I mean, if you're a Mississippian, you feel this intimate connection with someone, and I will caution that by saying that I think Mississippi is a club for people of a certain status as well. So I think I can go anywhere in this country, and I will see someone who has an Ole Miss hat on, and we will say "hotty toddy" to each other.
Mm-hmm.
And there's this immediate connection. If you're wearing that on a subway platform in New York, that person will come up to you and say that, and you will enter into a conversation, and you will ultimately find someone in common, because Mississippi is a connection of, it's a group of small towns, and we don't really have a large city that really isolates us from each other. Jackson is 150,000 people, so that's a relatively small city. We don't have a Nashville or anything like Atlanta, which I think is much more like Los Angeles. I've often thought. So I think that's a big difference for us culturally. I think one of the observations that was made was that we are a rural state. I think we are a rural state. I think, and that connotes that we are also an agrarian state. And I would say not so much anymore. We are, a lot has grown in Mississippi, but agriculture is big business in Mississippi now. It's not the Mississippi I grew up in with a small farm. I grew up on a small farm, small 80-acre farm that in a lot of ways sustained my family. My father was a county agent. So there was this intimacy with the land. As I said, sometimes I feel like that 80 acres I grew up on owns my very body. Even though my family hasn't owned that land in 40 years. And that's a big difference, I think.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And well, I'm not from a farming background, from small Connecticut coastal city. We have lots of farms in my region, not agribusiness. They're still family farms. But then this is a sort of forgotten part of the world, Western Massachusetts. It's a place that hippies went back to the land. and grow all kinds of things. You know, but it's rural, but not in that sense where you can see the shift you're describing from small farm to agribusiness. I think a lot of our farmland was sort of, until recently, it was dairy farming, which is not sustainable here. Now it's small organic farms, and I take a sort of enormous pleasure in that part of Massachusetts life, but it's a world away from Boston, which is this a city that does suck people in. It's you know, it's not that big a city in terms of its raw population, but the metro area is huge, and a lot of young. I mean, my daughter's about to move there. It draws people in, but again, not just from the state, but from the region. In that way, it is more like Nashville or Atlanta. Probably more like Atlanta than Nashville.
I mean, my college friend Steve Yarborough now lives in Beverly, Massachusetts, and you know, he said after many years of living in Fresno, California, so he's lived all around the country, and for him, he's felt like Massachusetts has felt like coming home. He said, you know, he knows his neighbors. He said that coldness that you know we talk about. He said he has not sensed that in Massachusetts. He's felt very welcome there, but he does know, I think he still feels that Mississippi-ness very intimately.
Yeah.
And he still has it very much, it's very much a part of his voice. I have stripped that out of my voice.
Mm-hmm.
And he's been, and that's one of the things that he feels, he said, that's the one thing I can really hold on to, being a boy from Indianola, Mississippi, is my accent. I just can't change that.
But
Ralph and Michael, I'm going to pop in here real quick and say you've got 2 minutes to wind it down before we send everybody off to their breakout rooms.
Okay, thank you. Well, I mean, one thing that strikes me in what you're saying, Ralph, is that his hanging on to that voice. His hanging on to that voice. That's an icebreaker.
Yes, it is.
In suburban Boston, Beverly's a nice coastal suburbs where John Updike lived and wrote. That's an icebreaker, and that is going to produce friendliness in part because people with that voice are perceived as friendly in a way that maybe people with a voice like mine are not.
Well, that may very well be the case.
All right. Thank you both, Ralph and Michael, very much. I really appreciate that you spent some time after your presentations talking with us. We're about to move into our second breakout of the evening. You're all going to get sent off to breakout rooms, and this is a time where we can talk about what stands out from us from the readings that hopefully most of us got a chance to read from Michael and Ralph, and also from the conversation that they just engaged in. So you'll have about 15 minutes to work through those. Some questions that are available in a link in the chat. So click on that if you want to take a look at the questions, and then we'll come back together again after that for a few final observations from our two speakers. So I think we're going to be moved off into our break rooms here now any moment. Here we go.
All right, I think we are mostly back. So welcome back from your breakout rooms. I've just put a little note in the chat here. We'd love it if you could just take a moment to type in a phrase, a sentence about something that you're taking with you from your discussions in the breakout room, something that maybe came out of your discussions. This was the last question that we had asked you to think about in your groups. So if you want to just type that in. And I'll read a few of them. In Massachusetts, I feel like a route without trees. Such an enjoyable conversation, group of 10. Let's see here. We discussed the Mississippi need to stay in the state, unlike Massachusetts, which can be transient. We discussed mutual misperceptions, learned about the commonalities of our two states, learned that we're more alike than not, go gently with one another. Mississippi has a flow. Planning to read more about Massachusetts, the importance of the historic past of both states. I want to be with these new friends again. Let's see what else. Still struck with the notion of whether Massachusetts has contemporary regional literature and why or why not. I want to read the rest of the Morris book. Ralph's point about segregated cultural memory. Willie Morris died while I lived in Massachusetts. All right, let's see. This has been an exciting exchange. I look forward to the next one. I'll be thinking about different frames of reference where Massachusetts can draw its cultural identities in literature and such from the 19th century, and Mississippi often looks to the 20th century writers and singers. All right, great. You can continue reading everyone else's thoughts. I'd like to just turn it back over to our two speakers, to Michael Gorra and Ralph Eubanks, to just offer some closing thoughts, anything that maybe came up in your groups, anything that you'd like to say to kind of begin to pull things together. I'm not sure which one of you'd like to start.
I mean, one thing that I guess I will bring up that turned up in my group that maybe was the idea of the Gothic, the connection between the Gothic in both the South and the North. I guess wondering your thoughts about that, Michael, between the Gothic of Hawthorne and the Gothic of the South, and is Michael back?
Let's see here. Michael,
Yeah.
you're
Okay. Now that I am unmuted now, so I'm sorry about that.
Okay.
I think you're right that that Gothic strain is there in both states. That sense of old houses with secrets and of people having doubles that shadow them, of the past pursuing you, of something that your family has tried to hide that is going to come back and get you. That's emphatically there in both states. And
We have our freaks too.
Sorry?
We like our freaks. We like to kind of trot out our freaks.
Yeah. And that I'm not so sure about up here. Not anymore. And Hawthorne was the freak in his day, and people, somebody who's trying to make a living as a writer in an American that doesn't want you to do that. At that point, I don't know if we have the same fondness for our freaks, but I think the Gothic is there. I say that, and then I start thinking about, we were talking in my group about movies, and I start thinking about The Departed, and Jack Nicholson is a freak there, but then that's Jack Nicholson, and he's not from here. I had a question for you that came out of our group. We were talking about the Southern desire to explain, and somebody in my group from Massachusetts said that she didn't think we had that, and wondered what that said about us, that in Massachusetts that we don't have that same desire to explain. And then a woman from Mississippi answered, well, it's because we're storytellers. We like to sit and tell stories, and nobody has any secrets from each other, and we will spin out those stories, and they become a way of explaining, but it's mostly because we want to tell a story.
Yeah, I think we want to tell stories, but I think there's also, I would take issue with that we're kind of sharing our secrets. I think a lot of those stories come out of the secrets that people
yeah
keep there. And it's like, and all of a sudden we're, those stories is like, I didn't know that. And I always say, if you really want to find a good story in Mississippi, explore the silences, the things that people don't talk about. That's where the stories are. And I guess as someone who is a storyteller, that's what I'm always looking for, things that people don't talk about.
Mm-hmm.
And then it's within that you find a good story. Someone says, well, why are you always back in Mississippi? I said, because I don't, there are all the stories that are there. I don't, I'm a nonfiction writer because I always joke that it's because I'm not good at making stuff up, but it's that Mississippi, I don't have to make anything up. It's all there. So.
Yeah. You're reminding me of a line in the first line of a Eudora Welty story, whose title I can't remember, but it's where she describes three sisters getting together, as she puts it, to tell over a
Oh,
story
yeah.
from their family past. And a sense that these are stories that all three of the sisters know, that they've each told them probably. They've told those stories again and again, but there's a pleasure in hearing it over, in it being told
Because
once
it
more.
gets better each time you tell it.
Yeah, 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 yeah.
So yeah, I think that is that idea of stories and the way that we will. I mean, I think that's probably part of this time of isolation that has been so difficult, is that gathering with my fellow writers in Oxford hasn't been possible, where we do sit around and tell stories and joke with each other. And I think that's probably the part of this that has been the hardest for me, is as you meet with the people to find those stories and to listen to those stories. Sometimes you want to tell them, but other times you really just want to listen.
Yeah, yeah. Or sometimes you try to tell it in a way that tops the other person's version of that story.
Yeah, there's that too.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. No. When one person in my group said that, and I don't think we're not storytellers in quite that way. We tell jokes, we back chat, but we're not storytellers in quite that way. But one person from Mississippi in my group said when she visited New York, she found that New Yorkers were storytellers.
Oh, yes.
On the bus, that people want to tell you their story, and that's an interesting difference between, say, New York and New England. I had to tell one of my students from California the other day that New York was not New England, that New Yorkers would be shocked and chagrined to be lumped with us.
No.
New Yorkers do tell stories in a way that we don't. And in New York, of course, there is a distinctive 20th century literature.
And I think that may be why so many Mississippians feel so comfortable in New York.
Yeah.
Is, people, come out after they say, I was on the M3 this morning and I just heard someone talk about this and I don't believe that. And it's like,
yeah. One of my favorite columns in the Times is the Metropolitan Diary, where people write in with things they have overheard.
And when I'm in New York, I am always an eavesdropper.
Yes.
I'm an eavesdropper when I'm in Mississippi too, but I think the best eavesdropping that I've ever done has been in New York. Mm-hmm. In Mississippi, I kind of get involved in the conversation. I'm not eavesdropping. It's kind of like you get pulled into it.
Especially if you're wearing an Ole Miss cap, I guess.
Especially if you're wearing an Ole Miss cap, you're brought into it. And even if that other person is wearing a Mississippi State hat, that creates another type of discussion.
Mm-hmm. Okay. What's it called? The Egg Bowl?
Yes, the Egg Bowl.
Okay, yeah.
And we won this year. So.
I will say that once when I was in Oxford, I was checking into the Inn at Ole Miss for the Faulkner Conference, and there was a sign on the front, the check-in counter, that did tell me I was in a different part of the country, because it said something like 47 days until football. And the next day it said 46 days until football. And each day I was there, it got written down, and I thought, no, that's a different part.
Yeah, well, someone asked me once, why is the Mississippi Book Festival in the dead heat of August? And I said, one word: football.
Yeah.
We start out before football season begins. And, just bring your church fan and go and get through it. That's all you can do. So.
Oh, that's a fabulous way to wrap this up, Ralph. Thank you. I'm going to bust in now and bring this to a close. It's been a great hour and a half. I really want to thank both you and Michael for joining us and all of you here on this group together tonight. We do have 5 more of these Mississippi, Massachusetts events planned. Our next one will take place on a Thursday evening again, January 14th. It will be entitled Inside Out: The Lessons of Freedom Summer, where we'll explore the connections between our 2 states during the Civil Rights Movement. Before you all sign off, please take a look at the link in the chat and fill out our survey. You know, those surveys are really important to me in the humanities world. So take a moment, fill it out. It's very brief. And thank you again, all of you, for being here. It's been a great evening.
Thank you.
Thank you.